So be'emes, I am mamish exhausted, and I have been exhausted for a few days. But so I didn't have a lot of time to prepare, and I didn't have moichin to prepare, Baruch Hashem. But we're going to learn together. We'll learn a little bit together. This is where the Maharsha, this is where the Ben Yoyada speak the Masechas Beitzah, which is the Masechta of the Beis Medrash that we're learning in with Rav Eisenstein Shirim and all of the Shirim. And Be'ezras Hashem will try and learn a little bit together. And forgive me, the fundamental nakuda behind the way that I am trying to give these shirim freestyle in this way is built into the Klal HaGadol from the Orach Chaim HaKadosh. That when it comes to Inyane Aggadah, when it comes to Inyane Penimius, so what matters is that it's Svar Yeshera. The person certainly wants to get it right. The person certainly wants to get the content precise. But in the end of the day, the precision of the content is not ma'akev to the value of the process. There's a process of thinking, a way of thinking that Be'ezras Hashem is Kadosh HaKadoshim, Kol Zman that it's Svar Yeshera. So, Rav Tzadok HaKohen Meilablin, Rabbi Nachman, the Vilna Gaon, they point out that the texts that we use, the Svarim HaKadoshim that we use, are essential. Everything about them are essential. It's not just the content of Torah that is important to learn, but it is the context in which Torah is printed that is also deserving of limud. The history of the printing press, for example, is an idea that captures the attention of Rav Nasan of Nimrov in a very deep and fundamental spiritual way. But we know, especially the Gemara, Talmud, Torah Sheba'al Peh, what we see is these ideas, the way they emerge into the written text, which was a chiddush because it's Torah Sheba'al Peh, are ultimately deserving of study as well. And so the daf that you find something on, or the perek that something is associated with, or the siman in the Shulchan Aruch that is associated with a certain idea, there's an inherent connection. It's not random that a siman is 231 in Shulchan Aruch. That siman is specific to the content. It's not random that a certain Aggadah is found in a certain perek. That's essential. Rav Tzadok points us out all the time. We find the Gemaras of Churban Beis HaMikdash and Maseches Gittin. We find the Aggadah about man in Maseches Yom HaKippurim because each Masechta has its own content. And this is true also for the Dafim. Rav Itchemeyer Shlita does this a lot. Lahavdil, these tzaddikim, they look at the daf and they say, what is the daf saying about the content of the daf? Why is the content of this daf shaykh to the number related to the daf? And sometimes it's mistaber, sometimes it's not mistaber. Rabbi Nachman says when you're looking for ramazim and simanim ba'olam, so it's important not to be mafriz al amida. A person shouldn't look too hard. A person starts writing a sefer, it could be done, but every daf and its associated number, so then it becomes, a silly, not a silly idea, but it's not the Nekudas Emes. Nekudas Emes is that if it's matim and there's a kli ra'oi that the remez holds for the content, so then the number of the daf becomes very important. So on Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis in Maseches Beitzah, and with the Chevra from last night, we were talking about a heart. We were talking about the end of the Torah, which ends with a Lamed, and the beginning of the Torah, which begins with a Beis, and how the Ikra Avodah is to be building your heart out of that void that separates the end of the Torah and the beginning of a new cycle. And Rabbi Nachman's whole inyan was to make a leiv basar, to have a vulnerable heart, that mevakshe leiv, there's a bikush achar the leiv. And so the leiv is the center. The leiv is the melech baguf, the Sefer Yetzirah says. So when we see daf lamed beis, l'chayr it represents the leiv of a masechta, the leiv of something. Now, I can't claim to really know Beitzah well enough to point out what the heart of the Beitzah is, of Maseches Beitzah, but what I can say is that Rabbi Nachman has a few Torahs where he darshans a language in the Gemara of the Sabbath Beyasanoi, that the Greek mythologists, or those who wanted to ridicule Chazal, one of the questions, one of the riddles that they asked is that an egg, from where does it emerge? At what center point does the egg emerge from? And it's Rabbi Nachman over there has this very remarkable, obviously, teaching about the inside turning outwards and outwards emerging inside, right? And this kind of paradoxical folding and unfolding, and the leiv ha-beitzah, the heart of the egg, the question of how does something emerge out of nothing, the emtsiusa of the beitzah. So l'chayr we can say daf lamed beis in Maseches Beitzah, the leiv of beitzah will also hold a little bit of that paradox of this very the secret that stands in front of the daf with us. Be'ezras Hashem. So we'll look. It's an amazing thing. They touch upon such tremendous things here, obviously. So the Gemara says as follows. So after quoting a halacha in the name of Rav Nasan bar Abba, who is not a common Tana to be quoted, so the Gemara decides to quote the teachings collected in the name of Rav Nasan bar Abba. And we're going to see, hold in mind, Nasan bar Abba, there's certain names that are, it's hard to be Dairish. You could Dairish every Tana's name. Rav Itchemeyer, every Tana, every sheet of the Tana is associated with the name of the Tanya, associated with the town of the Tanya, with the Tana, and it's all Mekusher biyachad. They're all Mekusharim to different Bechinos. So when you see a name like Rav Nasan bar Abba, a givingness that is born out of Abba, out of an idea of Chachma, an offering, a grace of sorts, an opening of the hands, a giving, a Nasan, that comes from where? That comes from Abba. That comes from this place of Avinu Malkeinu, a place of Rahamim Rabbim. So we'll see Rabbi Nasan bar Abba and some of the teachings that he's saying are going to be shaykh to this inyan of Nasan bar Abba, of a givingness, of an acceptance, of a realization that Chayka Tov Lahetiv, and that Hashem is giving us goodness at every second. The ideas in this Gemara that Rav Nasan bar Abba are going to say are makusher to the name of Rav Nasan bar Abba, which is what? It's Nasan, it's a sense of receiving something undeserved. All I'm doing is opening my hands to receive the blessing. And where does that blessing come from? Bar Abba. It comes from a place of, in the Arizal, in the Zohar Kadosh, Abba means Chachma. It comes from a place of Chachma, it comes from a place of Ayin. But even on a Nigla level, right? Abba means Avinu Malkeinu. It's the Rahamim. It's the way that a Yiddish neshama is mekusher to the Rebbeinu Shalom by way of Rahamim. So the Gemaras, we'll see, are going to be in light of this inyan of Nesina bar Abba, a givingness that comes from the recognition of where it comes from, which is Chachma, which is Abba, which is Ayin. So Rabbi Nasan bar Abba Amar, Rabbi Nasan bar Abba says, Rav Asirei Bavel Yordei Gehennam Heim. That most of the wealthy in Bavel are those who can be referred to as those who will be descending into hell. Right? The descenders to hell. We're going to see, in accordance with the Meforshim, Yordei Gehennam, it's not a statement about how they're going to end up in hell or what's going to happen when they're in hell. When they're in Gehennam, when they're in Gehennam, but Yordei Gehennam is like a classification of a type of person. Like there's a person whose Metzias is this inyan of Yored Gehennam. Everyone's got to go to Gehennam through Gehennam, but not everyone's a Yored Gehennam. The Ben Yoyada makes a chiluk mufurash. That to go down into Gehennam doesn't mean that you have to mamish go down into it. You could just, be there. But there are others who are in the concept of Yordei Gehennam, that not only are they going to end up in Gehennam like everybody does for a minute, but they're going to spend their whole lives on a certain level falling down into Gehennam. Kilu, like, that's the Iker Hagdara of who I am. I'm someone who's perpetually descending down into Gehennam. So most of the wealthy in Bavel are Yordei Gehennam Heim. Kihad Shabtoi bar Marinos Ikla leBavel. Shabtoi bar Marinos. I'm not going to go near that name. So Kihad Shabtoi bar Marinos Ikla leBavel. So when Rav Shabtoi bar Marinos came to Bavel, Ba'aminayu Iska, he came to find from them, a way of a sect. V'lo yahavulei, and they didn't give him anything. And they also didn't give him any food. And so before we go into any of this, let's talk a little bit about the concept of Gehennam, which is, not a concept that we get to talk about so much. But if the Gemara is talking about it, then it's good to talk about it. So obviously, like anything else in the Torah HaKadosh, there's a Metzius HaDevarim and there's the Hasagas HaDevarim, like everything. There's the Etzem and there's the Gilui of it. Now, with regards to what Gehennam is, obviously, a person has to read the Rishonim, Ramban, Shar Gmul, and all we have is the words of the Rishonim. We have the words of Chazal, and we have the words of the Rishonim. So it's a tachaz. You come and see, you learn what Chazal say about it, and kach, and you understand the Reishis Chachma and why the Reishis Chachma is not really like the only truth. It's just kind of like a game of tricks to make it a bigger chiddush, to realize like that fiery Gehennam is not necessarily as real as we assume it to be. But Gehennam is Gehennam. But what does Gehennam mean to a person? Okay, and so when we talk about what Gehennam means to a person, that for me, it's what does Gehennam mean to me. And so there's a lashon from Rabbi Nachman. I believe it's in Torah Kuf Ayin Hey in Tinyana, but I could be off on the Torah. Rabbi Nachman says something powerful, something important, something that was picked up by those who wanted to find in Rabbi Nachman a prototype also of a certain type of not secular kind of Jewish personality, but more of this revolution of Hillel Zeitlin, Hashemim Komdomer of Hillel Zeitlin, loved this Nekuda from Rabbi Nachman. The academics loved this Nekuda from Rabbi Nachman Lahavdil. That Rabbi Nachman was revealing a deep inyan here that was mamish like for everybody. Right? The Torahs of the Tzaddikim are for everybody, but there's certain Torahs that everybody latches onto and they say, wow. So Rabbi Nachman says as follows. Rabbi Nachman says that, everybody talks about an Olam Haba. An Olam Haba. There's an Olam Haba somewhere. And I've got no problem believing in such a concept, right? What's difficult about believing in Olam Haba? He says, but people also talk about Olam Haza, and he says that I have a harder time believing in. He says, because I don't see Olam Haza b'chlal, I don't see any concept of Olam Haza, all I see is suffering, all I see is difficulty, and be'emes, it's Gehennam here. And Azoy Zak Rabbi Nachman. That be'emes, so we have to take at first glance that Gehennam is not only something that's shaykh to the scary things like after Misa and what the Ramban is writing about in Shar Gemul, but Gehennam is also a bechina. It's an aspect of experience in life that can be referred to on a certain level as Gehennam. As Gehennam. Yeah? And so again, this is my assumption is that if Chazal are talking about Gehennam, it's got to mean something to me right now. It's got to mean something very important to me. It's got to be the lave of Beitzah. It's got to be when Chazal are saying something and a person picks up on that word, that means you should think about the concept for a second, because there's a grand transmission of this idea from Har Sinai down to all of the tzaddikim. In the Maharal, the Maharal says, Mufurish, in numerous places, when describing the concept of Gehennam, he refers to Gehennam as a concept of he'edar of absence, of a lack of presence, of an emptiness, of vacuity, a kind of voided nature of things. So it's not, because we can't, obviously you can't say when the Maharal says Gehennam is he'edar, it can't be he'edar, because it can't be real he'edar if we're talking about it. This is what the Leshem says in the name of the Rishonim very often, that be'emes, there's no shum, halal b'shum ofen anywhere. There's no such thing as emptiness or an actualized void that's devoid of content. So because if we're talking about it as a void, if we're talking about it as he'edar, that means it's a way of grasping emptiness. And if I could grasp emptiness, then clearly I exist on a certain level to be able to grasp it, and Mamela, it's not empty because I'm right here. And so when the Maharal says it's he'edar, so what that means for me is, and I believe it's Mustaber, is that he'edar is when a person finds in their lives, when a person encounters certain circumstances, certain moments, certain positionings, postures in one's life where it's empty, it's vacant, it's boring in like the existential sense of the word. What? Minhag, right. Mitzvah sanashim milamudam, right? Chazal spoke about this. And this he'edar, so you're saying meaning Gehennam and Minhag. Okay, right. So Gehennam on a certain, right, it's an emptiness, right? It's like a hevel hevi gamhu. It's a certain, mimicry devoid of expression. And so, but he'edar also means just moments of emptiness, moments of boredom, moments where a person finds themselves devoid of the animating light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in their lives. And so to be a Yored Gehennam means to enter into a place where there's no chayas. There's no chayas. Gehennam is a place devoid of chayas. Gehennam is a place devoid of the chayas necessary to feel something from the moment. What a person is going to be feeling, okay, that's already a question. That's already dependent on a lot of factors. Be'emes, it's ultimately dependent on how we choose to think. But any moment that is ma'orer a person, bein l'tav, bein l'bish, for a good feeling or a more intense feeling, all of it is an encounter with reality. That's an encounter. That's a metzius. That's a rega. That's a moment. Yeah? Everyone with me? And so, Mamela, when we have a moment, there's a way of relating to it. There's a way of receiving it. And a person can receive it by way of chayus, where this moment is alive. This moment is essential. This moment is urgent. I'm present. I'm not distracted. I'm here. I'm engaged. I believe on my own way. I'm marking it in my mind as an accomplishment. I'm present. Hineni. I'm here for it. And that's the inyan of Gan Eden. To experience a moment in life like that is to be in the Chakat Hapuchin Kadishin, where you're mamish eating the apple. You're not thinking about the apple, you're eating the apple. You're eating an apple, you're eating a fruit. You're being given something to eat and you're eating. It's experience. It's Friday night. And that's what it means to be present. And Memela, there's the second option, which is a Gehennam of the moment, which is a Yordei Gehennam, where I see He'edar here. It's nothing. There's nothing here. There's nothing. And it's important to understand that these two options of the Gehennam and the Gan Eden, these are maybe 0.1% of the time. Most of the time it's unconsciousness, right? Most of the time a person is just like not even aware that they're not aware until they finally become that we've forgotten of being aware the whole day. So the active choice of a Gehennam moment and a Gan Eden moment is not this perpetual thing. It can be a perpetual thing. A person can live a life of Gan Eden and a person can be Yored Gehennam. But be'emes, we have moments in life. They asked Rav Froman, Schlusi Ogen Elena, Rav Menachem Froman. Rav Menachem Froman was a tremendous tzaddik. And Rav Menachem Froman got sick, and as he was kind of in the process of leaving this world, and he was very much makabeled and avoida and ahava and shalom in the deepest ways, so there was an interview with Rav Froman, who was just a light that had grown paler and less hair. And there was an interviewer who was asking Rav Froman about, Rav Froman was describing his dream and what shalom actually means, and what das shel shalom means. And the interviewer asked Rav Froman, he said, Hitzlachta b'chaim, were you did you do it? Did you taste it? Did you have what you're talking about? And Rav Froman, with mamish tears in his eyes, he said, Rigaim, yesh rigaim, there are moments. And so, whether it's a Gan Eden moment or a Gehenna moment is not something that's always happening necessarily, but it's the way we encounter moments. And so, what does it mean to be and also when it comes to Gehennam, so we just spoke about Gehennam last week, because Gehennam is created on the second day, which is a day of separation, which is the birthplace of Machlokes, which is the birthplace of separation and the appearance of disparity and disunity. That's the binyan of Gehennam, and that Gehennam is the opposite of the goodness, which is connectivity. So these two klalim, right? So that we have Gehennam as a state of experience, of He'edar in that moment, and that Gehennam is also shayach to disconnection and to separation. Yeah? One last nekuda on Gehennam, which we're going to see is going to be the culmination, is that Gehennam, that's one side of Gehennam. The other side of Gehennam is the Gevalt. At the other side of Gehennam, there's a Maisa. There's a Maisa brought down from the Baal Shem, that the day that the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh was born, the fires of hell extinguished. The fires of Gehennam extinguished. Why? Because, so the day the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh was born, the fires of Gehennam were extinguished. And the Malachim came to the Rebbeinu Shlalem and said, we have to have Gehennam. And so the Rebbeinu Shlalem said Azoi, he says, okay, since the air of Gan Eden has begun to grow stale, so let's take the air of Gan Eden, bring it down into Gehennam, and that will become the new Gehennam, and we'll draw a new breath into the Gan Eden, so we'll have a new Gan Eden. And so that's what happened. Once the Baal Shem Tov was born, the air of Gehennam became the stale air of Gan Eden. And so there's an inyan. There's an inyan mamish. There was inyanim by Rav Moshe Sasover, Befrat, and other tzaddikim all the time. Rav Moshe Sasover, his ikar place that he wanted to be was Gehennam. And that when he came to Shemayim, he said, no, I spent my entire life pidyon shvuyim, saving people from Gehennam. Again, a raya that Gehennam is a state of mind, like Rabbeinu says. But he says, I don't want to be here. Send me down to the other place. And he goes down to the other place, and Mamela, when the Or Tzaddik is there's no Gehennam, and they all come up with him to Gan Eden, and Kach, it was a big simcha. So there's an inyan with Gehennam, that Gehennam, in spite of the fact that it's He'edar, is specifically the site where we're going to see a certain new chayas emerge, an Or Chadash al Tzion Ta'ir. There's an amazing idea. It's such a beautiful, powerful, intuitive idea, but until you see the tzaddikim say it mufurish, right, you can't. And then when you have various tzaddikim saying it mufurish, it's even it's kodesh hakadashim. that the Gemara says that La'asid Lava, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to make a machal at tzadikim, v'liyushav b'neihem, and everybody's going to be pointing be'etzba'im and saying, Zek Eli V'amdehu, this is the Suda of the Lav Yasan, this is the Suda of the Shor Bar, the Rikud Aggadol, the Suda where David Malka Mashiach is going to bench, and the Ramami Pano brings down from Chazal, and the Leshem Shvoy Chaloima uses it, and in numerous places, and the Emek HaMelech uses it, and Rav Matal Zilber has many inyanim on it, and not Kamarna, there's another, I'm forgetting, Rimanov maybe, there's one tzaddik who particularly made use of this Nakuda. But the question is, where's there going to be enough room for this Suda? Where's there going to be room for a Suda this big? And the answer, Kuli Amalo Pligi, is that, it's going to be Gehennam. It's going to be in Gehennam. Because Be'emes, Gehennam is just the place where it's going to be the biggest Chiddush when it's Niskala to be part and parcel of Gan Eden. Right? So after all is said and done, and all the He'edar, obviously to understand, what it means to be a Yored Gehennam is also going to be the opportunity to learn what it means to be a Ben Olam Haba, Amir Tzashem. Okay, so let's go. So this is Rabbi Nasan bar Abba. So he says that most of the Gevirim in Bavel are Yordei Gehennam. Why? Because they don't give. They don't give of themselves. They're not making room for others. They don't provide. They don't offer. They're not Balei Chasadim. And yes, it means in the most practical way imaginable, because as we know, the Baal Tanya, when he spoke about, the Iker Giloy, what's the Iker Giloy, the Iker Mashal for it all? What's the Iker Mashal? All the time, giving tzedakah. And the Baal Tanya was not talking about bechinos of giving tzedakah. The Baal Tanya was talking about mamish giving tzedakah. So avada, the inyan of tzedakah is tzedakah mamish, and gemilas chasadim, and offering, two inyanim of offering help and offering food, a panimi and a makif, something internal and something external. But what they didn't have here was separation. There was a separation between them and the person who was seeking help, from the giver and the receiver. There was a period. Which is what? Which we said is the inyan of Gehennam, because Gehennam is the second day of creation where there's a period, and it doesn't say Kitov, because Gehennam was born, it's machlokes, it's separation. And Mamela, to be a Yored Gehennam means to live in a world with separation. To live in a world with separation between another Yid, between the self and the self, between the self and God, between the self and Torah, between the self and spouse, everything, on every level, separation. Separation, the shirish of that He'edar. And that's why they're Yordei Gehennam. Okay. Amar, Hani ma'arav rav ka'asu dechsiv v'nasan l'charachamim v'rachamecha. So the pasuk says, v'nasan l'charachamim v'rachamecha. Pasuk says, again, Nasan, right? We're talking in the Shitos of Rabbi Nasan ben bar Abba. So Nasan over here, the pasuk that he's darshaning is Mamis Shmo Keinhu, that he's darshaning about what the Iker Nakuda is. The Iker Nakuda is to learn how to have Rahamim. The Iker Nakuda in life, the Iker Nakuda is to learn how to care about the other. Is to learn how to be compassionate towards another person. Why? And Rabbi Nachman has numerous Torahs on this, on the certain tautological reality of Rahamim. Rabbi Nasan has a lashon very often, based on the Mishnah in Avos, which talks about the Asar Dvarim Shenivru Ben Hashmashos were the first pair of tongues, right? Because in the Beis HaMikdash there was a halacha that the tongues need to be made with tongues. So the kasha is, where does the first tongue come from, right? Which is the kasha of, where's the emsa of the egg? How does the chick emerge from the egg, which is Lamed Beis and Beitzah? And so the question is, I want Rahamim, right? Each person, Sostavar, wants Rahamim Rabim. We don't want Stam Rahamim, we want Rahamim Rabim. We need Rahamim Rabim. A person needs Rahamim Rabim. Without that recognition, then a person needs even more Rahamim. And so is it that we get Rahamim? We get Rahamim by being Merachim on another person. We get Rahamim by becoming Rahamim. We draw Rahamim down by becoming the expression of Rahamim in the world. And so to be a Merachim is to receive Rachmanas. And in order to receive Rachmanas, a person has to be a Merachim. What Rabbi Nasan is saying over here is that the next Memra that Chazal are bringing in response to the Ashirei Bavel, who are Yored Gehennam because of the period, is that Be'emes, the Ikr of everything is V'nasan l'charachamim v'rachamecha. Meaning, so what's the steer here? I'm merachim on you. Why? Because you gave me rachamim. You gave me rachamim. It's one of those places where, like the Matrix, there's like a slight glitch where we realize for a second, like, oh, even my koyach to do good is coming from you, Rebbeinu Shleilim. Even my power of bechira is coming from you. I'm a merachim because you give me the ability to be merachim. So Zalt Chazal kol merachim ala brios biyadua hu shuhu mezaro shel Avraham Avinu. Anybody who has rachamim on the brios l'rabos boi. Brios doesn't just mean yidden. Brios means every ounce of existence. Rabbi Nachman says the rachmanas a person has to have is on their guf. A person has rachamim on their guf in order to allow the guf to taste the sweetness of avodas Hashem, like the neshama tastes the sweetness of avodas Hashem. But kol merachim ala brios, anybody who has compassion, empathy for the brios, bar melashon, something outside of themselves. Every creature, every creation is something that is not me. Mamela, it's bar, it's outside. Rachamim is how do I relate from the inside to the outside? How do I relate? How do I empathize? How do I bridge the distance, the impossible distance between the self and other? The miracle of empathy is the bridge. It's the Gesher Tzar Ma'od of the inside of the self in its isolation to the other, and the way to get there is Rachamim. Rachamim is the bridge that allows me to connect to another person. Empathy. And so anybody who has empathy, biyadua, it's known. Yadua is the language of das, which is leiv ladas. It's very much mkusher to that emtsoyus, the kav emtsoy. Shumizaro shel Avraham Avinu. They're a child of Avraham Avinu. Not just Avraham Avinu. That brings us back to Rav Nasan bar Abba. And so the tikkun. What's the tikkun to this yorde Gehennam of a life of absence and emptiness and disconnection that the Ashirei Bavel experience? Ashirei Bavel just means those who are saturated and self-sufficient on things that are still Mekosher to Galus. As opposed to Aniyei Eretz Yisrael are people who are satisfied on the least element of Geula. Yeah, it's like it's a chiastic crisscross, right? It's the Ashirei Bavel are the rich ones who live in a state of impoverishment, and the Aniyei Eretz Yisrael who are coming to receive help from them are the impoverished ones who live in wealth. So it's the rich within impoverishment that is refusing to connect to the impoverishment within richness. Stam, it's just a machshava. Everybody with me? Ish? Okay. So, kol merachim al habrios biyadua shuhu mezaro shel Avraham Avinu. So what is rachamim? What is rachamim? And again, this is something that's totally believed, kol echad ve'echad. But rachamim, and a person sees this very much in the Mittler Rebbe, Schusa Ganalinu, more than the other tzaddikim in Lubavitch. The Rebbe Rashab did this also when he was playing Admor with his brother. That it was clear that the Rebbe Rashab was going to be the Admor, not the other brothers of the Rebbe Maharash, because when the Rebbe Rashab was pretending to be Admor, he would just cry with the people who would come near him, while the other brothers were not necessarily expressing that type of empathic response of joining, and so they weren't the ones who were going to be Admorim. But the Mittler Rebbe, you see in the Hakdamah to most of his Sfarim, he was writing to people who were mamish very active and working, and he was writing to people who were very, not disconnected, but people who were lachutz, very lachutz. And when you read the Hakdamos of the Mittler Rebbe, you see that he's speaking to a certain lachatz within his kehila, within his chasidim, where he was really trying to comfort them and kind of give spiritual insight that would allow them to find, the depths of spirituality, specifically in their meanderings and whatever they found themselves doing. And what the Mittler Rebbe does is he always brings himself into it. He says, and I know this because I'm like this. I know this because I'm like this, and I know what it means to be lost, and I know what it means to be in that place. As the Mittler Rebbe said in the name of his father, the Baal Tanya, right? Father, yeah. Father, the Baal Tanya, who says the name of his Rebbe, the Magid, who heard in the name of his master, the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh, She'ein ro'ui lahasig es razei Torah, ela mi shelibo doig b'kirbo, sheyesh lahamara shchira hativis hamushrash bo menu'urav. That the only kli ro'ui to receive the secrets of Torah is a certain propensity or a tendency towards a certain bitterness, melancholia, the kedusha that gives a person the capacity to be empathic to the sufferings of other people and to the reality of the world. The Mittler Rebbe also, the story goes that he wouldn't read a kvittel until he was able to identify the issue he was seeing in the other person within himself, because he wasn't roy to give eitzah in his mind until he could identify. And there was one time where the Rebbe passed out, or he fainted, and they came running in, and the Mittler Rebbe said he tried and he tried and he tried and he tried, and he couldn't come to that place, and he lost his koyach. But so Rahamim is to enter into the other person's level. Rahamim is the ability to see the world through the perspective of another person. Chesed has nothing to do with the other person. Loving kindness is my expressivity because that's what I do. It's a natural flow. Without boundary, it will flow wherever it goes, God forbid. Chesed is not dependent on a makabel. Chesed is mushba. And roiv chesed, riboy chesed is just hashpa'a b'ligvul. Rachamim, on the other hand, which is mushrosh in the kav ha'emtzai, which is a central pillar, which is a unification of extremes, as opposed to being an extreme thing. So Rachamim is when the sharedness, the openness, the offering of the self is rooted in the other person. It's rooted not in what the other person does, but the reality of the other person. Empathy is recognizing that other people are also a reality in my world. And even though kol olam lo nivra ela b'shvili, it's looking at the other person, ki'ilu their needs precede my needs. That ki'ilu I have to mamish enter into this person's life. And even though I still remain the separate entity and I can't ever join the individual, God forbid, and that's not the avodah is not codependency. The avodah is to share, to be there, and to reflect and to translate from my own experience to the other's experience, the shared humanity at the core of the experience. And the shared humanity at the core of the experience allows for sensitivity and vulnerability, and it diminishes anger. Anger is rooted in a sense of separation. This person has impinged upon me. This person is unworthy of this. Empathy, rachamim, is rooted in an equal footing, to realize that just as I walk a child of parents, that person is a child of parents. And just as I had dreams and frustrations, this person has dreams and frustrations. And when you begin to be mitanyein with the inyan of the other person, to enter into their threshold, to enter in your mind to their inner world, even though we might be as far as from the truth as night and day, but being mitanyein with the other person is rachamim. That's a unification. Bevadai. So Rachamim is driven by Chesed. Right? Rachamim is driven by Chesed, but pure Chesed wouldn't tolerate the gvur of Rachamim either. Right? That Rachamim sometimes is a limiting thing as well. And so the balance of Rachamim it's over here. It has to be. Meaning, in the end of the day, everything is rooted in Avraham Avinu. Everything. The chesed of Avraham, chesed ke'al kol hayom, the goodness of choy katoiv lahetiv, that Hashem created the world to bestow good, that's the ikar nekuda. That has to be the ikar nekuda. That is what empathy is driving towards, to reveal goodness in the person's life. So I would agree with you. And so kol merachim al abrios biyadua shu mizaro shel Avraham Avinu. It's clear that this person is a descendant of Avraham Avinu. The inyan of Avraham Avinu was the world of tikkun. It was a tikkun to Gehennam. Avraham Avinu's entire inyan was to be matzil b'nei Yisrael from Gehennam. Whether it's through Bris Milah or going into the Kivshan Ha'esh and surviving the fires of Gehennam. The whole inyan of Avraham Avinu is mi yoytze mitamei tohor lo echad. How could it be that purity is taken out of impurity? It could only be through a state of unification. It could only be the Rabbeinu Shalom. Avram comes from Terach. Avram comes from Gehennam. Avram comes from that place. Me'evar anar. Avraham saw a biro delekes. He, like Rabbeinu, saw a world on fire. He saw hell, not world. Biro delekes is what Rabbeinu is saying. He says, people say there's a world here. Adrab, it's Gehennam. And when Avraham Avinu says that this world is in flames, so that's the birthplace of Rahmanis. Birthplace of Rahmanis is recognizing that just as I feel sometimes as a Yered Gehennam, so too that person feels like a Yered Gehennam. And when I can understand that we share experience in this world, at that moment I can open myself up to be merachim. The hepech of what the Ashirei Bavel were doing. The hepech of ashirus, the hepech of that self-sufficiency that I'm not mitanyein with the other person. I'm not open to the tsar or the negia, the nekuda, the pekel of each and every person. V'chol mi she'enu merachem ala brios biyadua she'enu mizera shel Avraham Avinu. Again, it's both are essential here. Right? When Chazal are giving us the two sides of the coin, it means both elements are not mutually exclusive, but they feed into each other. So Rahamim is a sign of being from Avraham Avinu, and not being Merachim is a sign of not being from Avraham Avinu. And this is a kasha here, right? Because, we're talking about people are not Rahmanim, and this midah we're seeing in the Ashirei Bavel is mamish not Rachamim. They're not sharing, they're not joining. So how could it be? How could it be that they're Mushosh and Avraham Avinu? Meaning, Chazal are being magdir empathy as an essential trait within the neshama. It's an essential natural trait. It's not that a person can't be empathic. The only people that can't be empathic are incapable of being empathic. It's not that they're not empathic. Right? There's a prevention of empathy, which is a terrible thing, God forbid. But there's no yid that's not empathic. There's no hitaninus with the other person. There's no openness to the fact that Nishmas Yisrael is echad. That's the shirish of the Rachmanis of Klal Yisrael. That be'emes, when I'm merachim on myself, I'm merachim on another person because we're evarim beguf. It's the lave of the Beitzah. It's the nekuda hakolelas of Klal Yisrael, where every neshama is mushrish and Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. That's the shirish of Rachamim. And so mamil, if you have it, you have it. If you don't, you don't. And Chazal are taking this seriously. They said, clarify yourself here. We see this midah of the opposite of Rachmanis. It's not referred to here as Achzarius B'chal. It's just not being Merachim. And so how can you say, how can these people be B'nai Avram? And so Chazal continue.
What is Achzarius? Okay. What is Achzarius if it's not the absence of Rachim?
I think Achzarius is, I think there's a heart of stone that's unresponsive and doesn't care. It's apathetic to human experience. It's an inwardness. And then there are directions in which a person can relate to other people. So if you open up your heart a little bit, so then you can relate to people by way of compassion. You can relate to people by... Achzarius to me seems like a pathological, almost, sadist type of, impulse, a certain active desire to harm the other person.
It's not the absence of Rachmanis.
I don't think, no, it's not the absence of Rachmanis.
So I'm trying to understand that.
I think the absence of Rachmanis is probably a prerequisite for Achzarius, but I think Achzarius is more of a kum va'aseh, where you're deliberately trying to affect the other person in a cruel way. It's like a Kafka-esque type of bureaucratic type of thing. And by Rachamim, perhaps, is just more... I'm not mitanyen. I'm not open to the other person. I'm not lo akhpatli if it's good or bad for them. It's not, it's more midas stom is mukusher to it, I would say. But I mean, these are stam milim.
What does it mean to be merachim on yourself?
To be merachim on yourself is to find the kudos tovos, is to find the goodness within oneself based on the contextual awareness of where I am, of who I am. Of what Moshe Rabbeinu teaches us to do most is to say to ourselves that we are responsible, we are accountable, but we are not at fault. With the parts of us that we want to let go of, with the parts of us that hold us back. We are responsible for our goodness. I mean, we're not responsible for anything, but we identify with our goodness, and we don't identify with the opposite of our goodness. To see the good points, to be merachim, to give myself space, to give myself patience, to understand that I'm not the behavior or the thought, because if I trace it back, I could very clearly see the progression in which this thought became something that I'm experiencing in my life right now.
How would you work on something if you're not being aware of the fact that it's part of you?
Say again?
Taking the opposite side,
Yeah.
whatever you want to call it, you're doing it. So
Yeah.
the opposite of good, and you're saying not to be seeing it as part of who you are. But if you're not going to be identifying with it, then you wouldn't have to work on it. Not working on it, then you become blind.
Yeah, but I don't think, I personally would not make a direct leap from not identifying with it to not working on it. Identifying with the problem is becoming the problem to a certain degree. Where I see my pathology, I see my whatever perceived failure it is in my life as being indicative of who I am as an individual, and which it's not. It's not that. to identify with the fact that in the end of the day the Yetzer Hara is a driving force in one's life that is part and parcel of Kedusha, and it's the driver of Tov Ma'od, Avada. But to identify with any symptom that emerges from the Yetzer Hara, I think is again, it could be just terminology that we're using the word identify with, but to identify with something is to no longer see it as something that I've developed or something that I wear, and it's beginning to see it as who I am. And if I see something as who I am, then I'm not going to feel good about myself enough to try and make any healthy change. I think l'chayra we're talking about the same thing. It's just identifying. It doesn't mean repressing it. It doesn't mean erasing it or ignoring it. It means the Baal Shem Tov had a 3-stage process, and the Vilna Gaon has this also, Mefurish. The 3-stage process is Hachna'a, Havdalah, and Hamtaka. Hachna'a, Havdalah, and Hamtaka. This is the process towards which one engages with every mindful encounter in life. Hachna'a, Havdalah, and Hamtaka. Hachna'a is... It's hard. Rav Yitzchak Ginsburg has a lot on this, so the language is not precise necessarily with regards to a translation. Hachna'a is subduing something. It's making it smaller, is shrinking it down in size. Havdalah is separating oneself from it, and Hamtaka is sweetening it. So whenever a person encounters a problem in their life, the first step that a person has to do is be machniya it. I can't work on the problem if I am the problem. And so Mamela, the reason I feel like I'm a problem is because I'm magnifying the problem. I'm catastrophizing the problem. No matter what the problem is, my way of looking at it is making it unmanageable and unbearable in terms of Kedusha, in terms of spirituality. So to deal with it, a person has to be machniya it, a person has to minimize it, to break it down in size, to poke holes in its strength, so that now it's a smaller thing to deal with. In terms of anxiety, meaning instead of looking at 5 hours of open time in front of me, it's breaking the day into hour bite-sized pieces. 5 hours might be too much to deal with. 1 hour is okay to deal with. That's what being machniya something is. Then I separate myself from it. Then I'm able to look at the problem no longer as an identifying mark of who I am, but rather not a symptom or a behavior that has been developed or a way of thinking that's developed over time due to what it means to be a human being. So I'm mavdil myself from it. I'm not identifying with the problem. I'm not stuck in shame. Writes in Savazirus, based on the pasuk of Rishayim Malayim Charatos, that those who are... What? The Piasat Tzner Hashem Yimcham Domo. And so Rishayim Malayim Charatos, that the wicked are filled with shame. And Zak the Piasat Tzner as follows. He says, when a person transgresses, when a person crosses over a boundary of the self that they didn't want to cross over. Everybody with me? Then they did... What? In this context, I'm calling it shame. The halachic concept, but I think that what the Rebbe over there is describing is much more true with regards to a certain type of shame. I think. So Rishayim Aleim Charatos, why? Because when a person transgresses to whatever degree a person transgresses, when a person falls to wherever they've fallen, so there's a natural sense of shame that emerges. Shame happens when I identify myself with the failure. Guilt is what happens when I identify myself as someone who has carried out the problem. It's not me, it's something I've done. Guilt is a legalistic term. I have to fix something. I don't identify with it. Shame is where I identify so deeply with the problem itself that I feel, swamped in. Shame is it's a self-loathing. It's a very pleasant place to be sometimes, or a person just, you're kind of like marinating in the self-pity of it all. Like, how did I get here? And like, person's not doing anything. And Zak the Piasat Rebbe, human beings have not attention deficit disorder, Avada that too, but what he's referring to is like an emotional deficit disorder, that a person can't hold on to an emotion for a particularly long amount of time. Right? That's not b'metzias, that's because the Rebbe could have held on to an emotion for as long as he pleased. But a person with B'derech Klal can't hold on to an emotion for so long. So Mamela, a totzah of any type of transgression, mental, psychological, physical, is this immediate identification with the problem which drags me and submerges me in the mud of self-pity, of I'm a person who is X, Y, or Z. I'm a person who's X, Y, or Z. I am my problem. And memela, that shame is there, it's saturating, it's painful, whatever, and then it dissipates, because I can't hold on to emotions for very long. And when that heaviness of shame dissipates, the person's like, oh, I'm good, I've done tshuva, that terrible feeling has gone away, I feel like okay again. I feel like I can be metalech. And so he says that the shame feels like it's dealing with an issue, identifying with the issue feels like it's fixing it, but be'emes, it just gives us permission sometimes to perpetuate the behavior, because if I think I'm such a nebuch that is so identified with this problem, then, how could I ever change the problem? Make sense? Yeah?
You mentioned earlier responsibility, that we're not responsible for it. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean? Committed behavior.
What?
Right? You have Behir Nafshi, right? You committed behavior. So
Nevada person's responsible, infinitely responsible. When I said responsible before was in the sense that, for our good, we're not responsible for the good elements of us in the sense that it all comes from Hashem. And on that level, we're also not, you could put responsibility in quotation marks. A person is halachically responsible, a person is responsible on every level of nefesh, ruach, neshama, chai, yichida. Not yichida, but on the level of yichida, the deepest part of the self, mamish, Hashem is everything. And even on lesser parts of the self. It doesn't break away the need for tshuva. If anything, an idea like this upholds the need for tshuva. But be'emes, everything is Hashem, which means that even the parts of us that we feel are struggles or failures or things that continuously need to be worked on yomam v'layla with all of our strength, it doesn't take them out of the purview of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's unity and hashgacha pratis. So no matter how bad it is, or no matter how stuck it feels, it's still being stuck within Hashem. Does that make sense a little bit? B'chlal not. Yeah, vada not. But it's a question of Yediyah and Bechira, meaning on the level of Bechira, a person is infinitely responsible. On a level of Yediyah, from Hashem's perspective, Hashem is running everything, even what we experience in our lives. This is not God forbid me speaking.
He's running Behir Nafshi then, right? Meaning, Avram's 10 tests mean nothing. Hashem passed those tests. So what makes him so special?
It's an amazing question. It's an amazing question. What makes Avram special is that Hashem chose Avram.
So he himself is not worth anything because Hashem chose him.
He recognizes that he's not worth anything because Hashem chose him.
Okay. No, but
I don't mean to be. I'm not like trying to be Yoda. I'm not. It's an infinitely complex sugya, and that obviously thousands and thousands of very clear and rarefied. You're asking the question of all questions, Yediyah and Bechira, or Hashem's presence and Hashem's absence. So, but the Baal Shem Tov and his students inaugurated or revealed a new way of understanding this sugya, that al regel achas, Bechira exists absolutely within the universe of Yediyah.
But going back to Avraham, can't we say because Avraham had this strong Bechira to do the right thing, that's what made him who he was. That's why he was better than Noah. That's why he for the past Rabbi Jonathan Saxon points out, I'm saying at the end of his life, like Hashem tells Avraham, you're going to be a Goy Gadol, all these good things are going to happen, and Avraham doesn't wait around. He goes, he bears his wife, he finds a shidduch for his son. He doesn't wait for Hashem to do all these things for him. He does this on his own. So
right. No, it's a good. These are all. I don't have. It's not these sugyas of Avraham Avinu Avada. And if Rav Jonathan Sachs wrote it, then it doesn't need. It doesn't need any haskama. But all the ideas are true. All of them are true. There's infinite ways of approaching the light of Avraham Avinu. Infinite ways. And this question is obviously. The Rambam said. I'm going to talk about it, but ultimately there's no answer to it. And the Ravid's like, Rambam, if there's no answer to it, why talk about it? So be'emes, the tzaddikim point out that to deal with this question has to always be speech and silence. It's the speech of the Rambam, which is saying, let me try and understand this with all of the language in the world. And it's also the silence of the Ravid, which is realizing that I can never understand this whatsoever.
Rabbeinu Bechai has a great way of living. He says, the desires of the heart are your B'shur the intentions of your mind are your B'shur What happens afterwards, that's up to you.
Nice. Right, that's Viktor Frankl Havdil. Not Viktor Frankl, but Spus Yogan Aleinu. But he says, right, between the stimulus and the response is the Nakuda of free choice. Between the stimulus and the response. But it's what the tzaddikim refer to as bechira biyadiyah. We're perpetually choosing to live with the awareness that our choice is really Hashem's choice. But there's always a split second where I'm infinitely responsible, and then the next second, but it's not really. It's tekef umiyad. It's immediate. That a person comes to realize that everything is in the process, is in the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not there to allow anything, God forbid. Chalila v'chas. Halacha is the linchpin of the Shulchan Aruch. Look, you're hearing my own zerem, but with the linchpin of halacha, which is hariyu laHashem kol haaretz, it's the elevation of all things, and staying away from bad, and doing good, and trying one's best to be an eved Hashem and lishma and be kind and have midos tovas and yisheros. Then it's true that everything is in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, everything.
Could we maybe hear what Rav Nasan and Avraham was saying, talking about they were miraculous themselves?
I think that's the Gemara continues. The Gemara continues and it goes bevadai, and bevadai, right? Nasan v'richamecha. So just to end, because it comes like Rav Menachem is saying, it comes full circle. What we're going to see ultimately is that be'emes the tikkun. So we see that the Bnei Bavel are Yeridei Gehennam. Why? Because they're not Rahmanim. And the Gemara takes it seriously. So like, who were they if they're not Rahmanim? The Gemara goes hardcore. They're Erev Rav. That's like no, it's clear here that they're Erev Rav, which is a whole sugya, right? V'yadu, that is from Avraham Avinu. Erev Rav is the opposite of Das. It's Moshe. So there's infinite iterations of ideas kind of that come on each and every daf. And then the Gemara goes on to discuss, 4 different contexts in which one is not considered truly living. Really, it's a perush on Rabbi Nachman's Gemara teaching, perhaps, that a person's not really living here. It's more like Gehennam. So the Gemara starts off describing Gehennam, and then it goes into stages of where one is not truly living. You're not truly living if you're reliant on another person, on another person's table. You're not truly living if you only have like one garment, right? You're not truly living if your body's bothering you. Each one deserves, long time understanding. And I think ultimately the Gemara comes back to the fact that Rahamim is the shoresh of Gan Eden. Rahamim is the secret of Rav Nasan bar Abba, that Hashem is merachim on us, and then we learn how to have Rahamim on others. Bezras Hashem. Okay, shkoyach.